what does China want to achieve in this region? And what are the different means that you are likely to see it use and that it's already using? So I'll try and leave you with at least that much, and if hopefully that'll add value. That said, I don't want to spend time on this, but just I'm part of the Takshashila Institution. I had their I had their Indo-Pacific Studies program. We are a public policy think tank, which I think a fair number of people here are familiar with. But yeah, we do a bunch of interesting courses on defense, foreign affairs, China. So if anybody's interested, we're currently running a course on Chinese defense policies. So do check us out. It's useful to know. It's also useful to know this because it tells you a little bit about the value proposition where I come from. We are an organization which looks at the world from a realist lens. We're an organization which looks at social governance from a lens of pluralism and tolerance. We're an organization that prioritizes freedom, economic, political, all kinds. So that's the value proposition also that informs my research, which is always useful for people to know. Okay, that's it. I'm going to move on. So why was this conference significant? What did the conference do? There are a bunch of things that the conference did, right? The first thing was that it clarified the goals and tasks for peripheral diplomacy. It said that, and this is a very important statement, it said that the periphery is an important foundation for achieving development and prosperity. And this was new language. Historically, China has not necessarily looked at its immediate neighborhood, and the periphery is a broader definition, which I'll get to, but it has not looked at its immediate neighborhood from the perspective of opportunity. The lens has been one of threat. Today, I think the lens is shifting. And I think this is extremely important because increasingly what you're seeing, and this is, if you look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through the 1990s and thereafter, there has been essentially a tussle between who helms affairs within the foreign affairs architecture, the ministry, the party architecture. And it's usually been the people focused on the US, the people focused on the West. Today, you have people who are focused on the region, the periphery, who are helming central ministry. So Wang Yi is somebody who's a South, not just a South Asia guy, but a neighborhood person. Sun Weitong is a neighborhood person. So you've got more people who are today much more familiar with the neighborhood, and the view that the neighborhood is, an opportunity is there. But that view also persists with a sense of threat. So if you look at this quote from the official readout, it talks about how the periphery is an important foundation for achieving development and prosperity, but also a priority for safeguarding national security, right? So in some ways, what's happened is that historically, the approach towards the neighborhood and the periphery used to be one of trying to manage the neighborhood by managing the great power relationship. Today, the lens appears to be inverting, where the objective is to manage the neighborhood of the periphery, shape the environment out there to manage great power relations. So I think that inversion of lens is extremely important, and it's reflected in this language. The document talked about the goal being to build a community of common destiny for mankind. You've probably, for people who follow Chinese discourse, you probably, this phrase sort of, at a certain point of time, there's an overkill. It's nauseating because you repeatedly go through it. But what does it actually mean? And there is some sort of substance in what does it actually mean, right? The document, several documents in Chinese discourse, you can distill what it means. It means consolidating mutual trust with peripheral countries and supporting regional countries in pursuing their own development paths, which sounds great, but which basically means that making sure that they are not necessarily closely aligned with the United States or the broader West. As much as the US may be jettisoning liberal democracy, the Chinese still fear the idea of liberal democracy. So there is a certain sense of, not necessarily ensuring that people can be independent in their own way, properly managing contradictions and differences. If you look at China's periphery, it's quite a volatile region, even South Asia. In the last 48 hours, we've seen volatility in South Asia. So the idea of trying to, if you're a great power in the region, you're likely to try and make some more effort to try and manage the region. To what extent will you be involved from a security perspective? I'll get into. deepening development integration, building high quality interconnected networks, and strengthening production chains and supply chain cooperation. So this, again, the idea is no longer just a singular trading or an investment relationship. If you go back in history, it was a relationship of trade, of economic engagement. Then it was a relationship with BRI of a relationship of investment. Today, what the Chinese are saying is that, look, you need to build a deeper structural interconnectivity across the region. So you need to build regional supply chains. You need to have Chinese companies invested over there, which are feeding back to the Chinese market. Chinese goods must be traveling there, and therefore build a regional supply chain and networks which can potentially connect with global supply chains. So you need to have structurally deep integration with the region at an economic level. You need to jointly manage regional stability. Jointly is significant here. But the priority in this is law enforcement cooperation as opposed to necessarily military to military cooperation. Security is an element, but law enforcement is what the priority is to try and manage various risks and challenges. And finally, expand exchanges and interactions and people-to-people exchanges. I think this is an underappreciated element increasingly of Chinese diplomacy. Historically, the focus of Chinese diplomacy, and this was a criticism of Chinese diplomacy around the world, was that it is very elite focused. It doesn't necessarily appeal to the people. Increasingly, what we are seeing is that there is a shift in trying and appealing to the people, to try and do more things that have a direct impact on the lives of the people, whether it is the Global Development Initiative, which touches on the Sustainable Development Goals. So you want to try and build much more deeper connections with the people rather than just the elite and improve China's image. I think that is something that Beijing believes hurts it in the long run. The next point was the stress on BRI as the main platform. So for anybody who thinks that BRI is dead and replaced and whatever, it's not. It still is alive and kicking. It's modifying with private enterprises playing a much bigger role, but BRI still exists. And finally, the idea of building an Asian security model as a strategic foundation. Again, this is an interesting phrase in terms of what the Asian security model is. At first glance, when you go through Chinese discourse, the Asian security model fundamentally is we are not America. We don't follow American policies. We don't do block competition and things like that. And therefore, you come up with this model of inclusive security of some kind. But what does it really mean? It really means essentially emphasis on security via development. So trying to make sure that you continue to, you invest, you develop, you create opportunities, which can then potentially guarantee you security. So security comes via development. So you're likely to see much more development focus continued. Focus on economic and financial security. Trying to see if you can ensure macroeconomic policy coordination and regional financial stability. I think if you think of increasing new Chinese initiatives when it comes to the finance world, whether it was the AIIB, whether it's the BRICS NDB, whether it's now the proposed SCO bank. These are all efforts to try and create models where China becomes a dominant regional actor in the developing world. And it can allow China to ensure its own financial security and stability while providing alternatives to other countries. It can allow also China to, if you also think of things like de-dollarization, local currency trade, these are the kinds of things that you're likely to see much more. From a security perspective, focus on counterterrorism, de-radicalization, and cross-border crimes. This is essentially focused on Chinese security interests, but there are some places, of course, where you can have common security interests when it comes to some of these issues. Cooperation in nuclear facilities. China is a big investor in nuclear energy at home. It is likely that these are the kinds of abilities it will try and collaborate with other countries on. Cyberspace. It works with regional countries, particularly Central Asian countries in cyberspace security and a community of shared cyberspace governance. The idea of data security. Outer space and polar regions. China is increasingly a much more important partner for countries around the developing world when it comes to satellite launches, outer space work, and things like that. From a broader security perspective, the Asian security model from the Chinese perspective also covers public health security, biosecurity, diseases, vaccines, so on and so forth. And finally, also food and energy security. So if you see that the model is not necessarily a military perspective. It's not your conventional defense thinking. It's a model which looks at security in a far more holistic perspective, prioritizing areas of development and looking at non-traditional security risks. The objective of all of this is to try and find yourself in a place where you become, over a period of time, a favorable partner for regional countries who are looking to the US or the West for partnership. So that's broadly, so those are sort of the broad takeaways from the conference in a sort of overview nutshell. But there were some significant shifts, right? So, I mean, Dr. Ivan mentioned the previous peripheral diplomacy conference. That was the nomenclature used for that was symposium, and it was peripheral diplomacy symposium. This was a peripheral work central conference. The distinction between the two in the Chinese architecture is a symposium is a one-off. It's when you need to gather people, when you want information, you do a symposium. A central conference is ideally an annual event. So when you shift something from a symposium to a central conference, the anticipation is that you will now be doing this annually. So you've automatically upgraded the nature of the discussion, of the subject matter. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which is the third point here, is that was a peripheral diplomacy work symposium. This is a periphery work symposium. Again, it sounds very silly, but the nuance in this is that when you say peripheral diplomacy, you're only looking at it from a lens of foreign affairs management. When you say peripheral work, it means a holistic approach towards the region. It means it completely, so that's what I said, that it's security, it's economics, it's all of those. So you're bringing a whole set of internal organizations and departments to bear to say, look, we need to be mobilizing to do much more. And we have to look at this entire area in a much more holistic sense than just simply as diplomacy to manage the region. We need to shape the region. And for shaping the region, we need these bunch of different resources. The expanding scope of the periphery, as was mentioned, is quite interesting, right? I mean, officially, from my understanding, there are 28, but if you read some Chinese papers, even Ukraine is part of periphery. So the periphery can expand very large sometimes. There are 14 land neighbors, 6 maritime neighbors, 8 other states, including Singapore, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Maldives. And often when translated in English, the word gets translated. Even this conference, it gets translated as neighborhood work conference. Neighborhood would imply geography. Periphery does not. Also, the periphery, like I said, can expand quite significantly. Some of the papers that I will reference in this presentation going forward do mention things like Ukraine, do mention things like managing the conflict in the Middle East as part of peripheral management. So the periphery can extend to quite far depending on what the Chinese think of it eventually. The other interesting aspect, the shift is of the relationship between the periphery and great power competition. I've briefly talked about this, but if you think of what the Chinese analysts are saying, is that China's relationship with this periphery currently is in the best period of its history, but they have also entered a stage of deep interaction with the regional landscape and the changing world. The linkage of the periphery with great power games is a key variable in promoting an equitable and orderly development of a multipolar world. So basically, the argument here being made is that we need to be able to shape the periphery if we want to shape multipolarity in the future. So it's no longer that you deal with the US to manage the region, you deal with the region to manage your relationship with the US. Some examples of this. So what is the anxiety that if you look at Chinese discourse that you get from Chinese policymakers and Chinese scholars and analysts who are looking at the region, you get a persistent anxiety around the fact that the US seems to be adopting an integrated approach of security, economics, and diplomacy. And this has not changed even under Trump from the Chinese perspective, right? For all of Trump's talk of a G2 when he arrived in South Korea, all the agreements that he was linking with other countries included a significant economic security component. The economic security component targets China from Chinese perspective. So therefore, the response to this must also be a coordinated economic security diplomacy approach. There are concerns around, the US military exercise in the region. This is a concern, for example, which is strongly often raised with the Indian side, as India and US exercises in the recent past have been in the regions close to the boundary. And there are perceptions of tariffs and tools of economic coercion being used, which again, earlier this year, we heard reports of the Chinese sending letters and even the Ministry of Commerce quite publicly saying that countries must not cut deals to the detriment of China. So this is your anxiety, and therefore you need to act rather than just coerce. You need to act to try and shape outcomes for countries in the region. And I think that's where Beijing is working on. The final sort of shift that's taken place is this call for greater resource mobilization for an integrated engagement strategy. This is in response to, what the US has done, which is like their integrated economic diplomacy security strategy. You want an integrated response strategy to this. What's the objective of this integrated response strategy? To my mind, if you look at this framework, to me, this framework sort of helps grasp what are the Chinese objectives. If great power competition is what you're dealing with, your objective is to try and make sure that you, at least in your neighborhood, you are able to influence countries enough towards, take them to the tip of the spear as much as possible, but as far as possible, at least ensure the broadest base at the bottom. If you can ensure that countries in the region, in South Asia and other parts of the region, are neutral in terms of the competition between China and the US, then that's not bad. But if you can ensure that they defer to your interests, then that's better, and therefore you need to do much more. And finally, if you can reach a point where you are achieving overwhelming dominance in the decision-making of that country, then that's probably your best case outcome. Now, if you think of this framework and you apply it to countries in South Asia, I would argue that by and large, China is probably achieving neutrality, except for perhaps India. It's probably achieving neutrality with most of them. Even with countries like Nepal, it doesn't have complete deference. It has a certain degree of challenges in terms of ensuring deference. With Pakistan, by and large, I would argue that it has deference, but it shifts between deference and neutrality. But largely, it has deference in some ways, although there are frictions in that relationship. And likewise with Bangladesh, I would argue that today they have moved into the stage where they're at least far higher in the neutrality part of this bracket of this three-tier framework. So if you think of, say, Laos, Cambodia and all, they probably achieve deference to overwhelming dominance in those countries. So you can think of countries, and of course, this will not be a fixed state. Countries will move out and in depending on domestic changes, depending on other changes. But the objective is to try and, at the base level, at least ensure that these countries do not remain inimical to Chinese interests, and better if they defer to Chinese interests by and large. And I think that's part of the objective of Chinese diplomacy. And Chinese scholars and analysts talk about this quite freely in terms of what they want to achieve. Briefly, my takeaways, therefore, if you look at what China is doing across its periphery, 25 of its peripheral countries are BRI partners in terms of how it defines its periphery. China is the largest trading partner for 18 of them, at least. Economic diplomacy remains its preferred tool. And it will agreements with countries around the region. These will be much more broad and holistic. So if you look at even Chinese joint statements for different countries when leaders are visiting, they tend to have a broad agenda compared to the past. They tend to have certain specific agreements, and they tend to have components of all. There were a bunch of agreements from investments and grants to monies for port, monies for industrial cooperation. The Chinese agreed to extend the zero tariff policy till 2028 for Bangladeshi goods. They'll be talking about an FTA, which will have its own complications, but again, moving forward. And there's a potential deal for Chinese fighter jets, which is in consideration with Pakistan also. So if you can see that substantively, despite the turmoil in Bangladesh, they were able to manage to continue to move forward in terms of the nature of this relationship. The visit also resulted with sort of improved flight connectivity, and even before that, flight connectivity expanded. Later in the year, you had the China, Pakistan, Bangladesh trilateral dialogue set up. It's not a security dialogue in its conventional sense. And it covers a wide range of issues. And we'll see how far the Bangladeshi leadership, and depending on what happens in Bangladesh, how far that the government now engages with this going forward. But again, this is something, it just tells you that despite the turmoil in the country, they were able to manage to adapt. And even they were able to manage to deal with, despite the friction, they were able to manage to deal with the Sheikh Hasina government and deepen the broader relationship still, which I think we must appreciate. Of course, there are fundamental challenges to its policies within the region, not just with Bangladesh, but across the region. And that is economic policy, interest rates, repayment terms. That's always going to be a challenge. I mean, this time also the Bangladeshi leadership has been asking for lowering of interest rates, which the Chinese have not really agreed to. Although the repayment timelines they've extended, from what I gather. There's obviously a concern about the economic viability of the projects and whether those projects create enough jobs. That's always going to be a source of friction, but that has not stopped the nature of the depth of engagement. Domestic political uncertainty across the region, from Pakistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. I think the Chinese were caught flat-footed when it came to the developments in Nepal too. So I think that's always going to be a challenge for them, and I think Nepal is a good example, which shows that the limitations of diplomacy, which is simply elite focused, and the lack of understanding of social issues. To be fair, everybody was caught flat-footed with what happened in Nepal though. And finally, of course, at the end of the day, all of these countries will be hedging. There will be a certain degree of hedging amid great power competition. Nobody wants to put all their eggs in one basket. And I think Beijing understands that. And therefore, I go back to that triangular framework, that if you can achieve neutrality, that's good enough, even if you don't achieve overwhelming dominance in that country. And to me, therefore, that's the lens that I look at how Beijing engages in the region. I'll stop with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Majosh. This was a fantastic presentation. I have two very general questions, and then we'll open the floor for more. You said that the Chinese practically tried to use their periphery to influence great power relations in a reverse of the traditional pattern. Well, how do they want to influence those great power relations? Not only toward the US, but also toward other great powers like Russia or India or Japan, actually. Should I ask you my second question? Or?
Yeah, I can respond to that first. I think a good example of this is Central Asia. Mm-hmm. If you look at the nature of Chinese engagement in the Central Asian countries, China today is the biggest, not just the biggest economic partner for those countries, but it's also a much deeper security partner for these countries and across different domains. It's no longer looking at this region simply from the perspective of, can I wall myself and can I ensure security with regard to the three evils? But it's looking at it as an opportunity, as an open door to reach out to Europe through transport connectivity, as potential markets, potential avenues for natural resources, and as potential investment destinations also. And it is invested increasingly in the stability of the regime in the region, which means that the balance in terms of China's engagement, China's sort of influence in that region, vis-a-vis the balance of Russia's influence in the region, has started to shift. So I think the thinking is no longer that we need to talk to the great power to make sure that this region remains a sort of buffer region where our interests are taken care of and fine, you are the dominant actor. It's that we can be the dominant actor in the region. We can tie the region much more closely to ourselves, which means that we become much more influenced, and thereby we can deal with that great power, which in this case is Russia. So I think that's the shift. So if you think of East Asia, it's the same model where the idea is that this is our periphery. We are increasingly one of the biggest economic actors in the region. We are clearly a massive security actor in the region, and that security balance is also gradually shifting in our favor. And we need to continue to do that rather than deal with the US to draw red lines in East Asia, we can shape the direction of East Asia's development. And through that process of shifting the dynamic of East Asia, we deal with the US. And so then we deal with the position of strength, as opposed to dealing with the position of deference to American concerns. So that's what I mean when I say that this shift is taking place.
Yes. It's interesting how the other powers would respond to this, because that's a recipe for a lot of pushback, I believe, and not so much from Russia, but maybe from India and Japan and so on. My second question is, institutionally, how does India integrate such a very broad agenda? Because this definition of security is very broad. And I remember they were speaking about sub-central diplomacy, what they call sub-central diplomacy. So how do they coordinate all these kind of different initiatives in very different fields? It's very bureaucratic system, and I don't think this would be easy to do in a place like China.
I agree with you. And so that's why, a lot of people, when they see Chinese initiatives, GDI, GSI, GGI, GCI, they think of those as simply an expression of a desire for global influence, which it is, but it's also domestically a mobilizational tool. Because a lot of us who initially talked about these initiatives talked about them as, you looked at the individual policies under these initiatives, the individual tasks and measures, and they were not new. They were essentially, even in BRI, when BRI was initially launched, it was all sort of old wine, new bottle, right? But the purpose of giving them this sort of initiative architecture is to try and mobilize resources, mobilize bureaucracies, mobilize departments to come together and to try and work within this sort of framework. And that's, I think, the agenda of when you sort of frame this domestically. So when you think of the Global Security Initiative, I mean, I know when the Global Security Initiative was launched, there was lots of consternation, particularly in the US, that this is China launching some sort of, is this sort of new Chinese style NATO with Chinese characteristics? But it was not that. The objective of that was to articulate a vision, which basically said we're not the US, and to tell other countries that we'll not be like the US, but also to domestically say that, look, finance folks, commerce folks, trade guys, agricultural people, ministries, departments, and all of this, you need to prioritize security as your lens, right? And so provide a sort of common framework with which different ministries and all think, and then to try and get them to work together, with a particular agenda. I think that's what these initiatives are meant to do at home, is to try and provide frameworks within which policy thinking happens, policy framing happens, and conversations then take place. Now, whether they've been able to set up forums for this kind of coordination, no, we've not seen that as yet. At least publicly, we don't know that whether there are any forums for this kind of coordination. But what we have seen is that the policy thinking across different ministries prioritizes elements of security, prioritizes elements of engaging with foreign countries within certain parameters. And I think that's the kind of shift that they're trying to achieve. So is it going to happen in the near term and immediately? No. But I think gradually you will see much more focused approach, and you're likely to see also much more sort of internal mechanism set up, whether it's through the format of leading groups or something else, which will then help in this mobilization of resources. Even in one of the quotes that I didn't show, but one of the quotes talks about, I think it's a piece by Wang Jingsheng, who talks about how private companies and bureaucracies need to think about the region and the periphery from the principle of justice. Sounds wonderful. But what does justice means? He says justice means sometimes prioritizing the broader good over the profit motive. Sounds wonderful. But what does that really mean? What that really means is that if you're the private sector, you don't just prioritize your gains, you prioritize strategic interests. So you're mobilizing more resources through these, and the language is very wonderfully couched in these high-sounding moral terms. But that's where I think where this is going.
Thank you. That, by the way, resonates very well with the literature on kind of BRI's domestic bureaucratic mobilization too. It's very, very interesting. Well, thank you. Let me now open the floor for questions. So if you have comments, question, please first identify yourself and, ask your question. Anybody? So such an impressive presentation that people cannot think of. Yeah, please.
Hi, so I'm Nishant from RSIS. So you had mentioned that the BRI is evolving and there was more private sector participation. Could you clarify what that does? That mean they have more autonomy or what in what they're doing? And also, so related to your comments that you just made, which is the justice element of it, and the private sector should prioritize strategic goals instead of profit gain. So how does this work in a environment where the BRI, the private players are playing a greater role? So could you just contextualize that?
So if you look at the data that we have from in terms of BRI investments, and there's obviously no single central repository, but if you look at the data that exists, it'll tell you that over the last 2 years at least, you've seen Chinese private companies essentially invest as part of BRI in third countries. A lot of these are in areas of new energy, green technologies, things like that, new materials, raw materials, and things like that. So you will have these companies essentially trying to, why are they classified as BRI projects is because they've probably been part of conversations between governments, and they've obviously acquired lending through Chinese banks, in order to carry out these projects, and they're listed under the sort of BRI investment schedule. Conventionally, the BRI projects used to be broadly energy, transport, infrastructure, some degree of minerals, but not so much. But these were your sort of broad projects, big projects, and they were all funded by Chinese policy banks, the Exim Bank and CDB. That model has shifted. So it's no longer just Chinese policy banks. It's also a lot of private funding. It's also funding raised from multilateral institutions. And a lot of these are being then carried out by Chinese private entities. About, I think, just a little over half of these sort of initiatives. So they are sort of private enterprise investments, which are now classified as BRI investments. So the model of BRI is shifting because the government is saying that we will facilitate investments in these arenas now. It's no longer big ticket infrastructure transport projects that we need to do. It's these sort of private investments. So that's what I mean when I say that the model of BRI is shifting. It's no longer big policy banks funding massive infrastructure projects. So that is a shift that's taking place.
Other questions? Please, Paco.
Hi, Paco from RSIS as well. I have a very naive question first. Is India considered as a peripheric country? Was India represented in any way during this conference, the conference you mentioned in April 2025? And last question, you mentioned Ukraine at the beginning of your speech, like somewhat it was included within the conversation. So this is my three very basic questions.
Yeah, so the conference did not mention any countries, but India is seen as part of the periphery because that's how, like you said, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's think tank defines periphery. But also, if you look at Chinese foreign ministerial conferences, the foreign minister often, not often, but on occasion, references India as part of diplomacy in the periphery. Not always, but sometimes they do. Sometimes they also refer to India as a major power. Of late, it's happened a couple of times, which are again different idiosyncrasies and distinctions within the Chinese system. But they do see India as part of the periphery. No countries were represented at this conference. This was an internal conference of the Communist Party of China. So no countries were represented. In terms of Ukraine, what I mean is that the conceptualization within the Chinese strategic affairs community, which is distinct from the policymaker, is of the periphery is much larger. And they even tend to, and sometimes this is just grandiose talk, but there's even talk about, say, the Chinese peace plan for Ukraine, the 4-point Xi Jinping plan for Ukraine, which is not a peace plan, but that's how they project it. It's part of its peripheral diplomacy. They see, which it's useful to think of why they would make that argument, because it tells you a little bit about how they see instability in that part of the world as also impacting them directly. So to that extent, you can probably extend the logic. But to me, it's, to be polite, it's a bit of a bullshit logic, but that's what the idea of expanding China's stake around the world. It's in that context. I wouldn't classify it as Chinese periphery, but then I wouldn't classify Sri Lanka also as China's periphery, or Maldives also as China's periphery. But that's what they classify it as their zones of interest from a peripheral diplomacy point of view.
Sandeep, please.
Hi, I'm Sandeep. It was a very interesting presentation. I had a couple of questions. One was about border disputes, territorial disputes. I mean, periphery, one of the big problems with periphery is territorial disputes. China has it with India, Bhutan, Japan, Taiwan, South China Sea. Doesn't come up in your presentation. Like, was it something was under consideration there in this conference, and how did they think about it? And the other is, you've already kind of said it. I just was hoping if you could articulate in a separate, different way. What do you think? How does this conversation, how are they thinking in terms of their goals in periphery, and how are they prioritizing them? Are they thinking that primarily it is economic? These are markets that should be basically integrated within the Chinese industrial powerhouse. Are they thinking that these are geostrategic spaces which may be used to contain us? So we need to have some sort of buffer system here, some kind of neutralization of this region. Are they think, or they are prioritizing in terms of, civilizational, often argued, I imagine they don't do this, but often argued that, that China thinks of itself as a civilizational power, and everybody is a tributary that should basically pay homage to them. Some kind of hyper nationalistic conception like that, or there's some other way. How do they broadly think about what are their overarching goals, and how do they rank them?
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's a very difficult question, but
Yeah.
I mean, how
Sure. So, the conference didn't necessarily, I mean, nothing that came out of the conference directly talked about its immediate disputes. Those disputes get classified as core interests, and those are primary to all your diplomacy. So even when the Chinese are dealing with the Americans, you will hear them talk about the fact that your core interests are your, bottom lines, and those need to be respected. And in the context of the American engaging with the United States, it's fundamentally Taiwan at present, of course, but even the South China Sea and others. With every neighboring country, wherever you have this dispute, wherever you have a boundary dispute, whether it is in the South China Sea, whether it's with India, whether it's with Bhutan, that's a core interest. And that core interest is going to be constantly prioritized. There will be no compromise on that core interest. If you look at Chinese diplomacy, its actions, it's not really in a mood. It doesn't feel that it needs to compromise. Right? Beijing doesn't feel that it needs to compromise with anybody. At present, it feels like it enjoys overwhelming asymmetry in the region, and it does not necessarily need to compromise. So to that extent, I think what the conference tells you is that there is tremendous confidence, and that confidence is reflected in this thing of we don't necessarily need to compromise on any of these core interests. In fact, what we need to do is we need to continuously invest to actively leverage the advantages that we have and actively shape outcomes. So whether that means through infrastructure development, whether that means through deployments, whether that means through exercises, we can actually do these things, and we must continue to do them. So that's what my takeaway is. Although the conference does not, the readouts in any of the literature after the conference does not specifically talk about boundary disputes. In terms of what is the goal, I think the goal is not, it's not a defensive goal. It's not a goal of simply economic engagement. It's not a goal of simply thinking of it as a geostrategic space, which we must create as a buffer. And neither is it a goal of simply sort of engaging from a civilizational perspective. I think the goal is to say that we are the dominant player in this region. We are the hegemon in this region, and we must increasingly interconnect this region with ourselves, so that our hegemony becomes institutionalized. And that must play out in every dimension. It must play out in the economic dimension. It must play out in the security dimension increasingly. Although, like I said, from a security perspective, there is still a fair amount of strategic restraint in how China behaves. But it must also play out in terms of civilizational and people-to-people networks. Right? We are the dominant actor, and we must be able to have that position to shape the environment to our interests. And that's where they're moving from. And their argument is that by doing that, we emerge genuinely as the hegemon in this region. That will manage our relationship with the United States. Instead of talking to the US and saying, this is our region, respect us here, let's shape the environment. And once the facts on the ground change, once the interconnection happens, neither are the countries in the region going to want to jettison their relationship with us because of whatever the US might be offering. And neither is the US going to be able to do that much. So we would have changed the environment. So it's a very, to my mind, it's a very assertive, confident posture, which they are seemingly adopting, which is that this is our geostrategic space. We are the hegemon and we must emerge as the hegemon and therefore act as that. Now, whether they will be able to do that, whether they have the resources to do that, and whether they will be successful in doing that in terms of the resistance from certain countries is another matter altogether. But that's the ambition. Now, when ambition meets reality is where you will see friction. And I think which is where we are seeing friction also.
Other questions? Please.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I'm Go Swee Noi. I'm from the Straits Times. Just one question about this thing about China's shift from viewing the peripheral as a threat to viewing as an opportunity for China to move beyond the region, to go beyond the region. How should the region then react to this shift? So in terms of South Asia, in terms of India, is it something to be welcomed that China is not viewing the region as a threat? I mean, you spoke just now about resistance from countries in the region. On the other hand, should this shift be welcomed?
To the extent, I mean, it depends on each country, of course, but to the extent that that can create economic and development opportunities for a particular country, I presume they would welcome it. But to the extent that that creates dependencies which become vulnerabilities, which become sources of coercion, I think countries need to be conscious. And I put India in the same category. I mean, I would, from an Indian policy perspective, I would welcome Chinese economic engagement with certain caveats, which need to come from an Indian perspective, whether it is on investments, whether it is on trade, with the objective being that you can continue to deepen engagement, whether it's people-to-people engagement, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's economic engagement, while not necessarily yielding coercibility. So I think it's a bit of trying to find a balance between what kind of engagement is okay and where engagement can become a vulnerability. So from an investment point of view, for example, if I was to think of the Indian example, I mean, for each country, it will be a very different approach, but just from an Indian perspective, my view would be India should be open to Chinese investment. India should not be closed to Chinese investment. If Chinese entities want to invest in India, India should be open to it. But which sectors is that investment coming in? What is the nature of that investment? Those are the kind of things that we need to scrutinize. There are certain sectors where I think it's perfectly fine to be completely open. There must be no scrutiny. It's perfectly fine. There are certain sectors, however, where I think, particularly sectors where there is connectivity, you know, where there is signals connectivity and things like that, grid connectivity when it comes to energy, I would say that you need to be much more careful. You need to probably say no. But if it's road transport in general, I don't see why not. If it is the automotive sector, I don't see why not. If it is solar energy infrastructure, components, parts, I don't see why not. So I think there are, you know, you need to apply a bit of a fine tooth comb to some of these issues, because I think all of these countries would generally welcome greater capital and economic engagement. But when that becomes a risk is when that yields potential to be coerced, or potential for the other entity to coerce you. And given that we are in a world where everybody is leveraging their dominance in either different supply chains, whether their dominance at multilateral institutions, I think countries are much more cognizant and much more wary of being coerced. So I think that's the balance that each country needs to strike. And it will be a different balance for every country, depending on where they are, what their capabilities are, what state capacity you have, and who your other partners are, and all of that. So it'll be a different balance for different countries. So my recommendation would be, yes, please welcome it to the extent that it does not expand, it does not make you vulnerable to coercion.
Please. Professor Moch.
Well, thanks for the really nice talk. I think none of us follow China so closely, so I think understanding, I mean, how Chinese think and present it, you do a lot of that. So it's really very helpful for those who don't do this in it. But I think also how you've explained how the peripheral diplomacy works, its structure, its objectives, fits in nicely with the, more simple, broader propositions. Say all great powers have to pacify their own periphery and penetrate the periphery of the rival power. I mean, which is what China is doing in many ways. It's all over in Latin America. But within the region, what you kind of explained so nicely fits in with that thing that, look, you need to dominate your own region and limit the space for the United States or your rival power within the region. So it's really, that's what I mean, you really, and of course, you need to frame this in nicer slogans. As you said, like US used to talk in Latin America about United for Progress, Alliance for Progress, Common Goal, I mean, which is what all major powers present their own interest as collective interest within the region. So that gives a nice hegemonic, complement to what it's trying to. The second, I think that China has become the second largest economy, that it is a capital exporting country. It is that capability which allows you to do what it is doing. This China couldn't have done this in 50s, 60s, and 70s, where actually it was exporting revolution. To today, given its economic levers and its growing technological capabilities, gives it a chance to, pacify or neutralize your periphery. And I think we've seen that happen quite well. One thing, I mean, maybe you could expand a little bit on you talked about the security thing in terms of diplomacy, but Chinese arms sales in the neighborhood have dramatically grown. I mean, including in South Asia. So I suppose that's far more powerful than the foreign ministry sitting and diplomats and trying to solve problems, because that gives you deep influence with the security forces in any country. My questions, I mean, two questions. I mean, I think one, is it all a happy future for China, or are there contradictions that China will have to learn to manage? I mean, I think, India is not the question that this nationalism all over Asia, South Asia. So how does China overcome, its claims for territory, which are kind of extraordinary? That Natuna, which is say 1,500 miles or whatever it is from Chinese mainland, you say that's yours. And they get away with it. But so there are actually contradictions here. Right now, given the strength of their economic capabilities, they're able to dampen some of these. For example, today, if Indonesia, Thailand, the elimination of a large part of the small scale industries as the Chinese export machine keeps, doing things in the region, which really wiping out large parts of. So while the elite level interaction actually gives them that insurance, it doesn't translate into popular protest. But there have been, say, for example, in Burma, some of the projects have run into resistance. Every one of the countries has trade deficits. I mean, probably Malaysia is one of the exceptions. So in South Asia, that is actually true. Everyone has a massive trade deficit. That's not a problem. Territorial issues. India, take away India. That even Pakistan and China. I mean, I think it's not as if they don't have. So what are the potential weaknesses of this in this place? So I think maybe the probing of that might be useful. Second is a lot of times what they're doing, does it really need much work? Because if India has contradictions with its own neighbors, China doesn't have to do too much except pat India's neighbors, because if all of India's neighbors are trying to gain strategic autonomy. Either through partition or history of boundary disputes, you have a whole lot of things. So in a way, the contradictions of other powers, say India and South Asia, and the American policies in East Asia, shall we say, have created opening, right? I mean, I think even when, for example, what China has already achieved, forget limiting American influence, the US has sat on the first island chain for 75 years. That in spite of, finally now today, no country in East Asia is willing to confront, while they want to say economy, China, security, US. So in many ways, that's already achieved. But so where does this go after this? Does there no, I mean, again, coming back to the thing, is it happy that we are into this happy tension of the Chinese running this region beautifully with all this GSI, GCI, or Are there complications that are likely to come?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why in the Bangladesh slide that I had, domestic political turmoil was one of my points of challenge, because I think that that's fundamentally what's, just the instability inherent in the region, in South Asia, is going to be a challenge for China in whatever it does. The fact that in some ways, if I mean, you know the region very well. A few years ago, it seemed like, and even right now, it seems like in some ways the region is becoming politically bipolar, where there are entities which work with India, there are entities which prefer working with China, with China in some ways, and I think that is a recipe for constant challenge for China. So, and I think that will remain. It will also mean that the ability to be able to penetrate and influence will remain very limited, regardless. You will incrementally probably improve, but the ability will remain very, very limited. The ability to acquire actual deep penetrative capacity, basing and things like that will always be a challenge for China. So I think that at the heart, I mean, apart from just the public pushback, nationalism, I think just that political bipolarity in some ways that's emerging is going to be fundamentally limiting to what China can achieve in South Asia as a whole. In terms of trade deficits and in terms of industrial capacity, it depends, right? It depends which the country is and how it is reacting to some of that. What can you give to offset? I mean, for example, if you look at India and China, the trade deficit has long-term been an issue. But if the trade deficit continues to sustain, but it also fuels, say, exports to third countries, it also fuels your broader export, maybe, you can continue to get away with that process. I mean, I think the Chinese are quite aware of the fact that the trade deficit creates a challenge for them. And therefore, what you will see constantly pledges to developing world that we will expand imports from you. And in some cases, yes, imports have grown. And I think if they look to further diversify from the West, what they need is probably the big capital goods, technology, and things like that, which you're not going to get from the developing world. But at least in terms of raw materials, in terms of agricultural products, in terms of low-end products, I think that's what they are going to try to continue to do. Whether they are able to, whether supply chains will likely shift to those countries, I mean, we'll wait and see. The Chinese themselves are quite anxious about even low-end supply chains moving out of China. They would rather it go inland. So I think this will be a challenge for them down the road. And as a consequence, you will see much more. I mean, you will see countries, even like Indonesia, Turkey, all of them have tried to adopt sort of protectionist measures with regard to Chinese imports. So you will see countries wanting to protect their industrial base, and that will be a challenge for them. So it's not, to me, it's a reasonably comfortable situation comparatively, but it's not a happy situation from Beijing's perspective. And I don't think it'll be necessarily a happy situation. In terms of, where do we go from here and contradictions with other powers? I don't think the Chinese are looking at it and saying that we've arrived. I think they look at this region and they say that we are obviously far better off than we were 10, 15 years ago. The winds are favorable to us still in this region. And we need to continue down the path that we have continued, and try and make sure that the balance of power structurally shifts in our favor entirely. That the US finally acknowledges that the balance of power is shifted in our favor, and whatever Trump has said in terms of G2 actually materializes in something to that nature. I don't think they buy it, but their objective would for that to materialize in terms of the minds of the countries in this region. When I was in China last month, the one takeaway that I had from that entire conversation of 3 days was, from Beijing's perspective, when countries in the region think about any American proposition, they reflexively find it. There can be some issues there might be disagreements, but reflexively, they don't think about challenging American power or resisting American power. In the translation of that particular proposition into tangible outputs, you will negotiate, you will bargain, you will do all that. But reflexively, you don't question the authority of the United States to present something and to articulate something. You don't question American power. But reflexively, countries resist Chinese power. How can you effect that mindset change, where countries no longer reflexively resist it, where your first instance is not that this is, and that reflexive resistance is a product of a sense of illegitimacy. To shift that mindset, to me, that's when they get that, that's when you know that we are the regional dominant hegemon, we are the regional power. And I think their effort is to try and forge that through a whole range of actions, but also through narrative, also through constant reminders of asymmetry, particularly to India. And therefore it's important that countries which, particularly countries like India, must not internalize. They must appreciate, acknowledge asymmetry, mitigate it, however, to whatever extent, but not necessarily internalize it. I'm struck by, in India, we talk about the Chinese economy is 5-6 times larger than us. But if you look at per capita GDP, China is 14,000. The US is 80,000, about 5-6 times larger. So it's not just about the size, it's also certain thresholds in certain areas and certain categories. And I think those are the kinds of things that one needs to think about much more, particularly in India. I've gotten a little India specific, but particularly in India. But I think that's what the Chinese would desire. So where do you go from here? I think from their point of view, this reflexive shift of acquiescence as opposed to resistance.
Please.
There is some bit more about Pakistan.
Hmm.
It's actually developed historically.
Yeah.
Very close relationship. And Pakistan has a great relationship with the US as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, does the US question figure at all in the Chinese calculus when they think about Pakistan? So I think that will be interesting. I mean, given in the peripheral diplomacy, but the US in some senses is coming back into Pakistan. So I think, I don't know if you have some sense when you meet the Chinese scholars, whether they say something. That's one. The second, it's also the tail wags the dog. Right? Like in Maldives. One party is pro-China, one party is pro-India. So in a way, if there is rivalry, actually that gives room for the peripheral countries to play one against the other and get as much as you can from both. Which is what you see, the fact that Cambodia, Thailand, which is so close to the US, China, are willing to entertain Trump, sign on to declarations. So I think, it's really the quality of the rival powers diplomacy matters so much rather than structurally, objectively, the Chinese alone. So a US or India that improves is an India that improves its regional diplomacy. Can make it harder for China to pursue, but then we've had our own historic failures and America has its own problems. No, I completely agree with you. I think that the quality of, and that's why again, in my Bangladesh slide, one of the last points was hedging, because countries will do that and they have tremendous agency to be able to do that. And they are good at doing that. It's not just countries like India, which are seeking strategic autonomy, like you said, right? Everybody else will also. I think that on Pakistan, it depends on the nature of Pakistan's engagement with the United States. For example, I don't think that Beijing is necessarily terribly concerned about the critical minerals bit that Trump is talking about. But what they do have a problem with is deepening US-Pakistan military cooperation. I think that's something that you do read in Chinese discourse and Chinese analysts, when you talk to them, they do talk about this. They do talk about the fact, but at the same time, and this is something that I'm paraphrasing from conversations with Chinese scholars, is that I think they understand that Pakistan is a client state, but it's a very promiscuous client. It will seek many patrons, and it has at least three patrons in Saudi Arabia, the US, and China. And I think the Chinese don't mind a little bit of that burden sharing with regard to the client. But I think when it comes to sort of military cooperation, that's where their concerns lie. From an economic point of view, I think they understand that they are deeply invested. And I think they understand that they have far deeper networks within the broader system. So I don't think there is as much concern with regard to, Pakistan in that sense. But from a military perspective, I think that's the concern. And I think the anxiety is much more that greater engagement with the United States, greater domestic, essentially jeopardize Chinese stakes in the country. So I think that is primarily what you get from them in terms of their anxieties with regard to Pakistan. There's this business of the tail wagging the dog with regard to Pakistan, I think is very, very prominent from a Chinese perspective. I don't think, so when Operation Sindoor happened and the war between India and Pakistan, I think the Chinese were caught flat-footed
They were caught flat-footed. They were quite anxious about the nature. I mean, I think they were caught flat-footed in the sense that the rapid escalation is not something that they had anticipated. And I think that if you look at what the Chinese foreign minister told Ishak Dar on the evening of the ceasefire, he spoke to Doval and Dar both. But it was only to Ishak Dar that he said that now that a ceasefire has been reached, both sides must respect it. That was not a message that he gave Doval. So I think the Chinese are anxious. As much as they don't mind low-grade, low-intensity conflict between the two countries, which keeps India occupied, I think there is anxiety about escalation because the stakes are so much higher, and that's why if you look at Wang Yi's visit in August to the region, to India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, he tried to sort of project China as his broker in the region. He tried to front development as this common thing, and talked about how his experience in this visit has told him that this region has this great potential for development. And of course, he arrived at this compromise on the declaration for the SCO on terrorism. So I think that there is anxiety. There is anxiety in Pakistan's agency in dealing with Afghanistan also, which the Chinese are not terribly thrilled with. The current conflict between the Taliban and Pakistan is not something that the Chinese feel that they can manage. So I think that there is those anxieties, but not so much necessarily in terms of the broader US engagement.
Well, we're running a little bit out of time, but maybe last round of questions and then we'll wrap up. Anybody? Sandeep, you seem to have a question. Well, we started a little bit late, so it's fair.
Yeah. So no, just a follow up on this. Because you watch conversation within China closely, a project of this sort, a project of expansion of some sort, right? Establishing hegemony, as you said it. Does it have some kind of detractors or skepticism within the Chinese conversation as well, right? I mean, because I can think of few very obvious arguments for we might overextend ourselves. We might create too many tensions and blowback from the region or from other great powers, or that we may end up committing to something and that we can't deliver on it, and it kind of hurts our prestige. So there are all sorts of reasons why not to do it. Are there people within the establishment, within the larger discourse, who are arguing against it, or is there that kind of conversation, or is it just a very one-sided conversation? How is it playing out right now?
I would argue that maybe 15, 17 years ago, you would have seen much more open debate about some of these things. Today, you don't necessarily see as open a debate around some of these issues. But what you do see is people arguing for restraint, particularly restraint in terms of the use of the military. That's the first thing. And if you look at Chinese policy, you see when it comes to use of military, there is significant restraint in terms of how they think about it. The idea of overreach is very deeply embedded. I think the anxiety around overreach is quite deeply embedded in the system as a whole. So you do see that bit of restraint constantly reflected. You do see lots of discussion around, well, okay, if we are going to open ourselves up from an economic perspective to people, all these exchanges, it is that, and if we are going to invest in all these countries, what about investing in China? What about investing in our own people when there is high unemployment? And you saw this play out when it came to the K visa. The Chinese recently announced a high quality talent visa, K visa for extraordinary talents. And you saw lots of pushback on social media by people, even analysts writing that, hey, look, at a time when there is an employment challenge in China itself, why are you opening up to people? And the fact that a lot of Indians were expected to apply for the K visa created even more sort of a pushback, because there was a certain element of, we don't want the Indians, because I think in some ways, the last 7-8 years since Doklam, the narrative in society on India has also changed. So you can see pushback in that sense, in terms of investment. You can read within the writings of party thinkers, the writings of analysts and scholars outside the party remit also, this anxiety around transferring of industrial capacity to third countries. So in that sense, you will see debate and discussion and talk about restraint. But at the sort of highest echelons of the party, when you see, you don't necessarily get that kind of direct discourse which challenges the consensus, at least in the public, right? So it's in that sense, there's a bit of a black box element to it, where you may end up seeing the final policy document, which may be much more restrained than what was necessarily articulated a year, 2 years ago, or the interpretation of a GSI or a GDI when initially articulated may be thought of as very grand, but when the bits and pieces come together, when the ingredients come together and the dal is made, what you will see is that it's much more bland than what was initially articulated. So in that sense, you can understand perhaps that there was discord and disagreement over what the arguments were. But it's very difficult to pass through that line of what that process was. I've given you some examples of how you can find out where the debate is, but it's not necessarily as transparent and as open as that. But you can maybe do this comparison to try and figure out where the debate was. And you will see that also who briefs the leadership on certain issues. Those things are at least in public, right? We know at least as much as is shared as to who briefs the leadership. What do they write externally? That gives you a little bit of a sense of what kind of input and information the leadership may be getting in terms of their thinking processes, and what kind of limitations those individuals have articulated externally. They probably did articulate directly also. So that's where I think you figure out the debate. So there is a debate, there is discourse, there is disagreement, but figuring out the bits and pieces of disagreement is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle kind of thing, as opposed to much more direct.
Well, we're running out of time, but I feel tempted to ask you one last question.
Sure.
As a kind of China-India relations specialist. How do you think this shift in peripheral diplomacy is going to actually change practically China's policy toward India? Because obviously they're in a tow now. And so how does this tie with kind of this tow and this kind of shift in Chinese diplomacy toward India in the last, let's say, year?
Yeah.
roughly?
No, I think that the biggest shift is a much more clear and direct articulation of this need for acquiescence. It's not boundary. It's not quad. It's not. I mean, these are symptoms. These are not central issues. The central issue is that the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership, desires India's acquiescence of China's regional leadership. That means that when China proposes that the BRICS must expand in a certain way, that the SCO bank must emerge in a certain way, that we must find ways to not necessarily invite extra regional powers to have a bigger role in the region, India acquiesces. So I think when it comes to market access, when it comes to investments in India, India acquiesces. So when it comes to frameworks for regional governance across domains, when it comes to rules and standards for new technologies, when it comes to the role of extra-regional actors, when it comes to India's own market capability, that India acquiesces. That reflexively, that mindset shifts. And I think you can see that. I'll give you an example. In March this year, the press, I was reading this last night, the Chinese foreign minister does his annual press conference at the sidelines of the NPC. In March this year, when Wang Yi was asked about India, there's one question about India in that, he said some of the standard stuff, but he also said that, we must not let specific issues, we must not let differences become disputes, and specific issues must not be taken to be part of the whole of the relationship, which is standard Chinese line, which means that, don't let the boundary dispute determine the whole relationship or the direction of the whole relationship. But when Prime Minister Modi met Xi Jinping in September, the language was slightly different. The language was essentially that Xi Jinping telling Prime Minister Modi that if you get the strategic perception of us being partners and not rivals, and of us being, opportunities in development rather than threats, if we get that strategic perception right, then the specific issues will fall into place, which is very different, which is basically saying, change your perception of China, acquiesce to China's regional dominance. And once that happens, then whatever your concerns on these specific issues are, we'll address them, which is very different from saying, don't let specific issues dominate the relationship. So I think that subtle shift is a reflection of this sort of logic, where the idea is that reflexively, you must acquiesce to us as a hegemon. And I think that's where the relationship is right now.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Manoj for a wonderful presentation. It's a real pleasure having you.
Thank you so much.
I see.
Thank you so much.